This meeting is being recorded.
Good afternoon. For the last 4 years, Chile attracted the attention of constitutional lawyers. Chileans have been participating in a constitution-making experiment for the last 4 years, a constitutional process that has been hailed as exemplary. So twice the people of Chile have been asked to cast their votes for a new constitution, and both times they have said no to the proposal. How do constitution-making processes fail? What can we learn from the experience of Chile? That is the subject of today's conversation. My name is Jonathan Fissa. I'm a professor of law at the University of the Western Cape and currently holder of the research chair on constitutional design for divided societies. I would like to welcome all of you for joining our series, Conversations on Constitutional Design. Thank you for joining us. And to tell us more about the failed constitution-making process of Chile, we are joined by Esteban Szmulewicz, who is a professor at Universidad Católica del Norte in Chile. Esteban will have 40 minutes to make the presentation. After that, we will open the floor for questions and comments. And you can also use the chat box for comments and questions. With these words, it is my great pleasure to hand over to Esteban. Esteban, the virtual floor is yours. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you so much, dear Jonathan. And thank you for all the participants in this wonderful event. I mean, the name of the seminar sessions could not be more pertinent to what's been transpired on the Chilean constitution making processes. And I'm very happy to have accepted Professor Fesa's invitation to share with you some ideas on something that's been troubling our country, my countries, for the last 4 years indeed, and maybe even longer if we want to take a more longer historical perspective. First of all, let me just introduce what I think is the complexity of this topic and what's on the title of the presentation. Please let me know if you can see the slides. we are talking about constitution making in the complexities of 21st century societies. So that's why I think chair of constitutional design for divided societies is extremely relevant to today's world, and the lessons learned from the Chilean processes might help shed some light on that very topic and the wonderful questions Jonathan raised at the beginning. Well, first of all, I'd like to give you a little bit of a context of how these constitution-making processes, because we are talking about at least 3 separate, different attempts at creating a new constitution for Chile. And we'll be analyzing basically the last 2, because the first one was a little bit of more controlled, traditional process, whereas the last 2 processes in the last 4 years have the ones that have attracted more international attention, and they were more interesting in terms of constitution making, both for theory and for comparative constitutionalism. In order to understand these processes, first of all, we need to realize that during almost 30 years, between 1990s, when the Pinochet's dictatorship ended and the transition to democracy started in my home country, until almost the end of the second period of President Piñera. So what is there in the slides, the first 2 squares, right? Concertación years, and then the first attempt, we had very little participation, inclusion in constitution making. Constitutional reforms were enacted, many constitutional reforms to the current Chilean constitution of 1980s that was delegated by Pinochet's dictatorship in 1980 and still in place. So we had many constitutional reforms, but these were reforms enacted by the ordinary legislature, so the Congress, the National Congress, together with the presidency. But then in 2019, during the center-right second term, Sebastián Piñera's second term as a president, we had what has been called a social uprising, a very massive and at times violent movement that shook the government and the political system at that time. And as a result of that social uprising in 2019, there was a sort of agreement among political elites to start a consultation for the initiation of a new constitution-making process, creating a new constitution from the start. That's why I'm talking about a second constitutional attempt, because we had one before during the second mandate of a center-left president, so before Piñera, between 2015 and 2017, but that was a very controlled process that also did not end in a new constitution, but not for the same reasons, and a very much traditional process. So we are talking about the second constitutional attempt, and we had this referendum in October 2020, so in the context of a very complex world situation, the COVID-19 pandemic. And this referendum was to ask the people of Chile 2 main questions. First, whether to have a discussion on a new constitution or not. And second, if the answer to the first question was yes, then which body will be tasked with writing the draft proposal for the new constitution. And the options were a fully elected constitutional convention, or a mixed body comprised by half of the legislature and half of an elected, directly elected and separate elected constitutional convention. As you can see in the slide, in the end, the option of a fully elected constitutional convention won, as well as the option, obviously, for drafting a new constitution. And we had elections for that body in April 2021, also in a very complex context, and we'll come to that later on. In the midst, we had a change in government, and this will be relevant later on for some of the comments I'll make in December 2021 with presidential and parliament elections. And then we had an exit referendum in September 2022 because the Constitutional Convention produced a draft proposal. So this was submitted to the people to a yes or no vote, a referendum, and the rejection to that proposal won by a landslide, almost 62%. So as a result of that rejection in this second process, we had a third constitutional attempt, which was organized at late 2022, early 2023, and it was a response to some of the problems that were raised and noticed during this constitutional convention process. So we had here an expert commission to produce more of an organized, articulated draft by experts in constitutional law and political science and public policy, and also an elected constitutional council, a much more reduced control body than the Constitutional Convention, which mirror, in a sense, the election of the Senate, so the upper house in my home country. And this Constitutional Council was elected in May 2023, and it operated on the basis of the proposal drafted by the Experts Commission that worked in parallel between March and May 2023. This Constitutional Council produced a final draft in November 2023, and a second exit referendum was held in December 2023. So let me just draw a small point of regarding participation here. During 30 years, 1990 until 2020, we had no national referendums at all, not a single national referendum. And in the last 3 years, between the initial referendum October 2020 and then the exit referendum September 2022 and last year's referendum, we had 3 referendums. So this might give you an idea of the extreme circumstances of this constitution-making process, because we had a society that was not used to deliberation at a massive scale about something so complex as constitution making. This is a picture of this protest, massive protest in Chile's capital and many other cities in my home country in late 2019. And the main idea, and I want to emphasize 3 main points in these comments to these processes of the last 3 years, so the Constitutional Convention and the Constitutional Council. The main idea is that this balance that all the theoretical literature on constitution making stress between participation, representation, and deliberation in constitution making was not fully accomplished. I think a lot of ideas are very interesting in these 2 last processes. Also, we can recall the process of Bachelet's second period, this constitution making process between 2015 and 2017, but I think it's a little bit less interesting in terms of innovation in constitution making than the last 2. But still a lot of information, and that's why there's been a lot of international attention to try to learn the right lessons for future constitution making processes, not only in Chile, but hopefully in other countries as well. And so I'll organize my comments, dear Jonathan and dear colleagues, around these 3 ideas. So participation, representation, and deliberation. And from the start, I'll say, I think the most problematic is representational deliberation. If one looks at participation and inclusion, which are not exactly the same, that's why I'm separating the concept of participation and inclusion. But if one looks at that variable in constitution making in these last two processes in Chile, I think there are very interesting innovations that can be adapted and applied to other settings, other contexts. But in the realm of representation and in the realm of deliberation, I think there are problems, challenges that we need to look into more detail. So let me go first quickly into participation and inclusion, because I think here these are not so problematic as the issues of representation and deliberation. In terms of participation and inclusion, we had broad inclusion of different societal interests and underrepresented communities. I'll show you some examples later on. But let me just say that democratic innovation, especially in the process of 2021 and 2022, so the Constitutional Convention, let's call it the process of the Constitutional Convention, we had gender parity, full gender parity in the Constitutional Convention, and reserved seats of more than 10% of the convention for indigenous peoples. Let me just say that indigenous peoples, according to different measurements, account for around 30% of Chile's population, but had very little participation in full political issues. So talking about constitution making, right? So big political questions. They had participation in small policy making, certain projects when their communities are affected. So there's our environmental assessment systems and participation in under the umbrella of the International Labour Organization Covenant 169. So those are legal public policy instruments that have particular specific problems. But when we talk about more constitutional issues, or issues of recognition, plurinationality, claims for their own land, autonomy for their own territory, their own recognition of their own legal system, and we are talking about many communities. Probably from the outside, you know of the Mapuche population, and also the Mapuche people, and also the Rapa Nui, which are located in Easter Island, Isla de Pascua, Rapa Nui, but there are many other indigenous communities in the country. So this was very important in the first process. Also, special regulation regarding more open constitutional participation. And I'm listing here many of the examples, but we can go into the details in the Q&A session. But there were citizens' initiative, like citizens' initiative of law in parliament, citizens' initiative for constitutional reforms. There were decentralized participation by many civil society organizations. The convention itself deliberated in many different parts of the country. So you have to realize it's a very long country with a very complicated geography. So this was a substantive effort on the states to go into the more remote areas and to make inclusion and participation of the people that had been underrepresented in constitution making in the last years. In the process of the Constitutional Council in 2023, there were less of these innovations because some of the learning was that it was too much of a complication, too long process of consultation, and it was very difficult to organize and systematize all the different views in citizens' inputs into the drafting of the text of the proposed constitution. And obviously, as you can notice, the process of the Constitutional Council lasted just a few months of 2023. So it's very unlikely, because of time constraints, to put together many innovations in democratic participation. So it was a very much controlled process than the first one. But still, we had citizens participation, citizens initiative, organized group, etc. We can go on into the details on that. So I think it's very important that we had many democratic innovations that have been praised by the literature as an interesting experiment in constitution making. You use quite a lot of digital tools. If we want to go into the discussion of digital online constitutionalism, there's many interesting examples. I can show you the web pages. We had a special TV channel, a web page, online presentations. Me myself, I was presenting at all the processes in different instances, always online. Because also we had the pandemic in the midst, so it was kind of a need of the circumstances. But so this is very interesting in many regards. And here's a picture of an indigenous peoples meeting with some of the members of the Constitutional Convention in 2021 in a very remote area. As I stressed before, the country's geography is very complicated for citizens' inclusion and participation, marginalized communities. So this was very important for the legitimacy of the process. So I would start with this positive note. I think this is a positive learning from the Chile example. We can go into the details of different instances and different types of participation and what are the pros and cons of that. Also on the topic of participation, but going into a little bit more of a complicated area, I'll say referendums are something that we need to look into into much consideration in constitution making. These are central mechanisms, obviously, of constitution making. Here we had originally 2 referendums that were planned. So the first referendum in 2020, and then the exit referendum in 2022. And then we added, because of the failure of that process, because of the rejection, we added a new process with a new referendum. So we had 3 referendums in 3 years. And these 3 referendums were held under different electoral rules. So that's very complicated in the design. And I think that's, on hindsight, a mistake of the process to have 3 referendums with different rules. And also we had to look at the context of this referendum and what is called the public sphere or not. So the creation of adequate conditions for deliberation in something that is so complex as a whole, an entire constitution, in the context of our divided, unequal, very highly unequal societies. It's probably not the same to have referendums in Switzerland than to have referendums in South Africa or Chile. Of course, it's very difficult. And if you want to have a good process, a process that is properly analyzed and deliberated, you need to have media inform, a lot of public information from the state, try to counterbalance fake news or misinformation that's obviously present. I'm not saying that this was the main cause, but it was undoubtedly present to a certain degree in both processes. The influence of social media had its advantages and disadvantages, but overall, the referendums were held, and this is a quote of Negreto, as political scientists have analyzed very in deep both processes. Both processes were not held with a proper deliberation. So they were simply aggregates of raw preferences in terms of ideology or other reasons, partisanship for voting, and not carefully looking at the reasons behind certain provisions that were very controversial. This is very interesting. A quick note: there are very good examples of referendums in constitution making that do have more deliberative nature. Just in Latin America, in Uruguay, for instance, we have a political system that is used to referendums. So the political system itself incorporates the actual occurrence or not of a referendum and take into account the existence of a referendum as part of a normal process of policy making at a constitutional level, of course. So all the actors of the political system, political parties, representatives, interest groups, social movements, take into account the existence, the potential existence of the referendum and act accordingly. Here we, as I mentioned in the beginning, we had a society that had no referendum at all for 30 years, and then suddenly had 3 referendums on full constitution issues with different loaded topics in many aspects that we can go into the details. I'm not going to go much on the topics itself because I'll try to focus on the processes, but we can go into the topics and we'll see that there were many topics there, dear Jonathan, like regionalism, autonomy, indigenous communities, the role of the state in the provision of social rights, the political system, the judiciary, constitutional revision, the role of the armed forces, etc., etc. So the economic system. So basically everything you can think about as a content of a new constitution was discussed and deeply discussed. So without proper deliberation at the public sphere, referendums can be a very nasty business. Inside and outside the representative bodies, deliberation, as we mentioned, was also very rarely observed. Largely, and we'll see that in a second with empirical information, the groups that control the bodies at the Constitutional Convention first, and then at the Constitutional Council, try to speak to their own constituencies in terms of identities. So whether it's left-wing, leftist oriented, or right-wing, very conservative, very traditionalist, they didn't try to speak to more generalized concepts as we could expect as constitutional scholars to go into the text of the Constitution. So they tried to include in the Constitution a language that spoke to their own identities without much concern about what the adversaries, what the opposition will think about. And this also was prevalent in the deliberations outside the representative body. So when the society started discussing the draft proposal in the coming period to the referendums, right, in the last few weeks or months coming to the referendum in September 2022 and then in December 2023, also the different societal groups outside the representative bodies were also talking to their own identity groups. Very difficult to have real good constitutional deliberation in terms of Elster's, of Ackerman's idea of a constitutional moment, right? And then I'll come to the point that I think it's most pressing and most complicated for analyzing constitution making in Chile in the last 3 or 4 years, is that this process was held in the very stressful condition of a crisis of representative institutions. There's been quite a lot of talk in my home country of the crisis of democracy, the crisis of legitimacy, and there's a lot of debate on that concept. But I would say there's a very large agreement on academia and civil society that we experience a crisis of representative institutions. So maybe not a crisis of democracy as a whole, but definitely a crisis of political parties and the parliament and the governments as the main representative institutions. As you can see in this is the most accurate poll, I would say, until from 1990 until mid-2019. So a little before the social uprising that was the basis, the societal basis, societal push towards constitution making, we see the notorious fall in trust in the main political representative institutions. So we can see political parties on the green line. We see the Senate, the green line at the bottom, right? 5% or even less of trust in political parties. We see the Senate dropping from 63% in 1990. So the Senate in Chile is a very strong institution, had a very good democratic Republican tradition coming back to our independence in 1818. The first democratic institution before the presidency was the Senate and the Chamber of Deputies. So it had quite a lot of support from the people in 1990, when democracy was restored. But it dropped to 7%, only 7% in 2019, in the few months before the social uprising. And the same can be said to the Catholic Church, the judiciary, the armed forces, the public prosecution office, and the police forces. I'm just showing you here the political institutions. This is, I think it's overarching of different sort of societal institutions, businesses, where to put also the main businesses, even workers' union also have experienced a drop in public trust, but representative and political institutions crisis of representation, it's appalling. So in this background, to have an election for a constitutional convention first, and then a constitutional council, it was a little bit complicated to have a good process in terms of representation. But representation is needed for constitution making, because otherwise it's very difficult to have success. And this has been documented in the literature, looking at the cases of South Africa, precisely, Colombia, and many others that have been successful in terms of channeling societal conflict, deep societal conflicts, into approval of a new constitution. But without proper legitimate political parties, and without an alliance between social movements and those parties supporting the process of constitution making, it's very difficult to have successful constitution making. And this point is being made by David Landau and Rosalind Dixon in a recent article, and they call it sociological utopian constitutionalism. I think it's a very interesting expression, because the broad representation, the inclusion that we discussed before is present. So it's a sociological constitution, and the wide diversity of the society is well representative in the process of drafting, writing, and deliberating the constitution. But without political parties and without an alliance between social movements and political parties, it becomes a certain utopia, right? It becomes a certain utopia, and it's very difficult either to agree on a new constitution or to implement this constitution if it were to be approved. In the Chilean cases, it was not approved, obviously, in both cases, what we have seen, but there are many examples that the Landau and Dixon document of constitutions that are approved but are not implemented because are sociological utopian constitutionalism. I think it's very interesting to analyze. So the need to come back to the need of strong political parties, especially when we're talking about discussions of constitution making, and to forge alliances between social movements and these political parties. See the empirics, just see the empirics. In the first process, the constitutional conventions is the numbers on your left side, the Convención Constitucional, so Constitutional Convention. We see the percentage of elected members of the convention with certain experience in public office, whether it's elected office or a non-elected office, like public servants, bureaucrats, and this was a minority. Then we had the expert commission that I mentioned, was this body for the process of the Constitutional Council after the rejection in September 2022. So the political elites wanted to control a little bit more the process of drafting a new constitution, and the Congress appointed an expert commission, constitutional scholars, political scientists, public policy experts, a small body that drafted a proposal for the deliberation of the elected body called Constitutional Council. And obviously, in the expert commission, we see a lot of people with experience in public office. So that was a very positive experience. The expert commission represented all the parties in Congress, going from the what can fairly call extreme right to extreme left. The Communist Party or even more anarchist forces or left-wing forces in Congress, 24 members with gender parity, 12 women, 12 men, drafted and agreed on a full text of a new constitution. But this was only the basis for the discussion of the Constitutional Council. And the Constitutional Council, once again, we see the numbers on the right side of the screen, lacked sufficient public experience. A lot of independence, a lot of people with no public experience, which was good in terms of renewal of the elites. Of course, it was good in terms of inclusion, in terms of participation, but it was not so good in terms of deliberation and in terms of proper representation. Also, just to further emphasize this idea of problems of representation, we see here the different electoral rules for all the elections and referendums that were held in this period. First, we see the referendum in 2020. Then we see the election of the Constitutional Convention 2021. Then the exit referendum, September 2022. The election of the Constitutional Council, May 2023. And the election, the referendum, it's you can see it's a lot of information. The referendum, the final referendum in December last year. As you can notice, all this resulted in different levels of participation. The first two electoral processes were held under voluntary voting rules, so we see much less participation. And especially, and this is very important to notice, much less participation in the election of the Constitutional Convention in 2021, the second lines, right? Second numbers. That's color with a lot of large majority of red color and minority of blue. The red color is center left, most left, I would say, very little center, mostly left wing, and the blue color represents center right, and then we'll see more right wing orientated. So limited participation in this election. This was held in April 2021, so complicated conditions, COVID still very in place. We had the referendum in October 2020, a few months behind, with a very strong mandate, but also with limited participation. So a lot of push for the left-wing forces. The right wing did not mobilize at all. Actually, I think they did an explicit strategy of demobilization for this election, and they bluntly lost that election. And they were underrepresented in the Constitutional Convention with participation that was voluntary, but with the exit referendum in September 2022 with mandatory voting. So we see that the huge difference in numbers on between the second and the third row, right? The third row being the exit referendum 2022. So this is the election with the largest participation in recent years in my home country. And we see large majority of blue votes, right? So that's rejection, center right wing against the approval of the center left or left wing forces. But then we had, very interesting, the election of the Constitutional Council, April-May 2023, so the last body to draft a proposal. And this election, notice the gray row is 2.6 million voters, so more than 20% of the electorate that voted to blank or annul their votes. So no preference, because they were rejecting the process at all. They were rejecting the process as a whole because of the rejection the last year, a little bit of tiredness in the population regarding constitutional debates, the need to tackle pressing issues like security, the economy was in a very bad situation, it's still recovering, but it's very complicated, migration, so a lot of pressing issues, and the population was very tired of this general constitutional discussion. So we see a lot of, more than 20% of no preferences, blank and null votes. So that's unprecedented in any voting experiences worldwide, I would say. And then so we had then the exit referendum with mandatory voting again, and we see a large votes against the proposal. Again, no with the proposal drafted by the Constitutional Council. With the context then, and I'm concluding now, dear Jonathan, with the context of very weak political parties, it's very easy to have this electoral volatility. So it's very easy to have this electoral volatility, to have a strong left wing, then right wing, then vote against the right wing. It seems very rare, right? It seems almost inexplicable. But I think it can be explained because of the context, because of the lack of adherence, a lack of legitimacy of political parties, and the rejection vote, the punishment votes against who is in power. We had a government in power in 2019 and 2020, so the first process, it was a right-wing government, so the left-wing forces were voting against this right-wing government, and now we have a left-wing government in power. So the right-wing forces voted against this government that was pushing forward the proposal. We talk about the particularities of the elections. So 2021, pandemic affected voting, especially of the right wing, and 2023, voting affected the Boric government, and also the concern of more immediate pressing issues like security, the economy, migration. Conclusions. Careful consideration is needed of representative institutions, particularly political parties, but also business association, workers' unions, students' association. All the societal interests need to be taken into account, but together with political parties, we cannot dismiss political parties, especially in the context of a crisis representative institution. It's very important to operate in a non-political as usual mode. So in the context of constitutional making, we have to be able to really deliberate in terms of judgment answers, considering not only rational arguments, also emotional arguments are needed, of course, but in terms of trying to change our natural preferences, trying to dialogue with the people that think differently, both internally at the body's task with drafting the proposal, but also in the discussion, especially if we include a referendum, an exit referendum at the end. Participation mechanism, I think, were very important, that we had a lot to learn in terms of democratic innovation, but we also need a lot to learn in terms of how to build civic education, civic formation, how to actually create a public sphere in the context of today's society with social media, with the internet, and all these challenges. So democracy has a capacity to self-learn, provided that we are able to learn the right lessons. Thank you so much, and looking forward to your questions and comments.
Thank you very much, Esteban. That was really a very interesting and comprehensive insight into the two constitution-making processes in Chile. We have about, I think, 15 minutes for questions and comments. So you can directly ask the questions, but you can also use the chat box to pose your questions. Perhaps maybe I can start with a question. So one of the points that come across from your presentation is that one of the reasons why the process has failed to produce a constitution that's acceptable by the people is the non-involvement or the exclusion of political parties, that there was some sort of conflict between the civil society and the political elites, that the process was dominated by the civil society. So perhaps maybe if you can just explain how political parties were excluded from the process, and also if that was the case, did they also campaign against the constitution, the political elite, the political parties? And the other question that I want to pose is that, so far we're talking about the process, yes? In both cases, does the content of the constitution, what was included in the draft constitution, does it also matter in terms of the acceptance by the public? Could it be argued also that in both cases, the constitutions represented a particular viewpoint, which did not represent a compromise between contending views about how the Chilean society should be organized and regulated? So to what extent also that has affected the process? And I think perhaps maybe we can take one more question, Tabising.
Sure.
You can go ahead.
Thank you, Prof. I just wanted to add into your question to say that in terms of representation and the exclusion of political parties, are they excluded in terms of ethnic lines, or what is the reasoning behind the exclusion actually? Is it like the way in Kenya, when we compare it in Kenya, to say that ethnicity takes the lead? Is it the same with Chile? Thank you.
Thank you.
All right. Perhaps maybe Esteban, you can start with these questions, and then we can go second round.
Well, wonderful questions. I mean, first of all, to go into your questions, Jonathan, I would say the problems of conflicts of or disengagement between civil society and political elites, political parties, was mostly present during the first process, of course, constitutional convention. And you're right to ask what the reasons behind this. Well, first of all, obviously, there was the context, the societal context. So a lot of rejection of all the political parties and all the political elites. So this profound crisis of representation that I mentioned before. So any independents were looked at with a lot of positive perspective, with a lot of consideration. But before 2020, it was very difficult for independents to have a position in representative institution. It was mostly a process, political process controlled by political parties. So because of the context of a crisis of representative institutions, in 2020, the Congress itself approved certain rules for inclusion of independents in the forthcoming election of the Constitutional Convention. So once we knew that the constitutional discussions was going to take place and we'll have to have this elected body, 3 innovations were introduced that alter the normal politics as before. Gender parity, I would say that was very, very positive, and there's little disagreement with that, with gender parity. There's obviously discussion on the details, but in overall, an egalitarian and equality representation of men and women was accepted, and it's been considered a very positive development, a positive learning in recent years. A second innovation was reserved seats for indigenous people. I mentioned so 10% of the Constitutional Convention, 17 seats out of 100 in the Constitutional Convention were reserved for indigenous population. And because of the sociology of these and the mobilization of the different groups in the election of the convention, these indigenous people, in a large majority, they were leaning towards center-left or left ideologies. So they was not purely independence in terms of sort of philosophy, taking into consideration the good reasons behind different proposals. That these were fairly compromised and loaded independence towards leaning towards center-left or even left-wing orientation. And the third innovation is that independents were allowed to form lists outside parties to present themselves, and because we had proportional representation, and to present themselves as a list of independents, very rare. So we have political parties that are groups of people that adhere to a certain ideology and have certain values and so on and so forth. But we also, in parallel, we have the same benefits of the electoral system to independents that were just united for the purpose of this election. So that rule benefited the groups of independents because of the context of a representation crisis. So people were eager to vote more for independence, and the electoral system benefited this independence. But these independents were, once again, not pure independents. It was proved that it was by a large majority independents leaning towards the center-left or even the left wing of the spectrum. So it was not that independence balanced out between right wing and left wing. So this affected also the content deliberation. Campaign against political or by political parties then because of their exclusion, especially in the first process. Well, this was very clear, especially on part of the right wing that was underrepresented in the Constitutional Convention. Only 25% of the Constitutional Convention was right wing, and the society, our society, is very divided. It's very different elections in the last year had given always the right wing around 40-45%. The government at that time was headed by a center-right president. So 25% is clearly underrepresentation of the right wing. So obviously the right wing in Congress, when the convention ended this work and we were headed towards the referendum, used all sort of devices of power to sabotage or to criticize openly the proposal. But also center parties were also underrepresented in the convention. So not only the right wing, but also the center parties. And because of the content, now coming to your third question, Jonathan, the content in the first proposal, because of the composition of the convention, was a content very transformative for our context. It included plurinationalism. It included wide representation and recognition of rights to indigenous communities. It included vaguely drafted right to abortion, very controversial issue in our divided societies, and it was drafted in a very vague way. It included a strong role for the state in the provision of education, health, and pensions, so social rights, very strong protection of the environment. It was called the Eco Constitution, so the ecologist constitution. We can agree on the content, but the fact is that the society was deeply divided on those issues. So a society deeply divided in those issues, and in the context of groups, powerful groups that were not carefully represented in the convention and not even considered. So it was a lot of opposition. And then in the second proposal, the Constitutional Council, because it was dominated by the right wing and even the extreme right wing of the electorate, the proposal tried to incorporate changes in the wording of the constitutional provision that would make it difficult for a center-left wing government in the future to change, to alter. So, for instance, going to the same topics, it reduced the role of the state in regarding to social rights, health, education, pensions, basically, reduce the rights of workers to organize, to protest. It even tried to constrain the right to abortion in the Constitution. So one proposal tried to include an explicit right to abortion, the other proposal to explicitly try to constrain the right to abortion. And those are debates that are very divisive, and I will say these are not easily addressed questions for a constitutional process. Those are processes that need more deliberation and more balancing. Finally, to the point, very quickly, sorry to go very quickly, but to the point on ethnic lines. In the first process, just to give you an example, the president of the first Constitutional Convention was lady historian from the Mapuche population, and she was the president of the Constitutional Convention. So for a country that had no constitutional recognition of 12% of at least 12% of the population for many, many years, centuries, to have this figure, it's very powerful. And also, as I mentioned, there were many, many provisions in terms of rights of indigenous communities. But given the context of a divided society, this later on was very controversial. And the provisions were not so carefully drafted as to give no option to implausible interpretations. We know as constitutional scholars that any constitutional provision, it's likely to be debated in courts, in parliament. But as far as constitutional drafting goes, the first proposal was very vague. So obviously, the positions against recognition of indigenous people use this vague wording to say, look, these provisions were open to an extreme fragmentation of our country, extreme litigation in courts, very extreme problems for economic development, and so on and so forth. I think those were a little bit of unfounded fears, but this was the context, the real politics context. The Constitutional Convention should have been able to manage this uncertainty and this context, and were not able to manage. In the second process, the drafting by the experts commission was very precise in terms of precise and limited rights, but still recognition of indigenous communities in the Constitution, but very limited, very precise, very carefully written. So this was not a problem in the second process. The second process had a problem for other reasons, for more conservative, right-wing orientated reasons.
Thank you very much. I think we have a few minutes, but we have a couple of questions. If you can allow us to just, Esteban, to take for a few more minutes.
Yes, of course.
Resida asked a question in the chat box, says, thank you for the thought-provoking presentation. I'm curious as to how the constitution-making process in other Latin American countries have unfolded, considering that most South American countries have adopted constitutions in the 1990s. And Abdul Jabbar asks two questions. Says, thank you for the presentation. How can constitution-making process balance public participation and political elite or slash parties? How can a process be immune from excessive interference from political class? And then another question from Jawar: can Chile's failed constitution be attributed to failure of parliamentary constitution-making process?
Let me just take note to failure of parliament. Okay, yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you so much. Very good questions. I'm so glad that this conversation, that is the title of Jonathan's series, conversation. It's raised very, very good questions, profound questions, and even for me to reflect further. Well, constitution making in Latin America has been a very turbulent, troublesome business. So we have different sort of types of processes. There are countries like Argentina, Brazil to a certain degree, that had new constitutions in the last since the 80s, but these new constitutions were mostly reforms of previous texts. So the dictatorship that was prevalent in the Latin American countries during the 60s and 70s, in those countries did not transform the political system or the socioeconomic system or the constitution much. So the new constitutions were mostly reformed to certain specific points and are considered new constitutions, in fact, but not transformative constitutions, not fully transformative constitutions. Sometimes when seen from abroad, thinking about Latin American constitutions, one thinks about transformative constitutions, right? But so I would say there's a first group of countries, Uruguay also in that category, Brazil, Uruguay, Argentina, mostly Mexico to a certain degree, that are not transformative new constitutions, that are constitutions that are reforms of previous texts. So they continue a certain tradition of constitutionalism. We have a second group of transformative new constitutions that had been fully democratic and with a certain democratic liberal success. And I would say Bolivia and Colombia are a good example of this. Colombia in the 90s, Bolivia in the 20s, they had constitution-making process and they enacted fully new, transformative new constitutions. But the process of writing these constitutions was very inclusive at the same time as representing the political elites. So it was a compromise, as Jonathan rightly said, a compromise between different political elites, right-wing and left-wing, but also between societal groups and the representative institutions. And we had a third group of more complicated non-liberal, to put it in a label, non-liberal constitutionalism, basically in Venezuela, but also in certain countries in Central America, of new constitutions enacted by democratic means, but where large majorities, mostly of a left-wing orientation, took over the process of drafting the constitution and drafted a constitution for their own purposes. And then it went approval of a public referendum or of a convention. In the case of Venezuela, there was no referendum. So the assembly that had a very large majority of left-wing drafted a left-wing constitution and approved by itself a left-wing constitution. And we have seen the democratic process unfolding in Venezuela in a very authoritarian way. I cannot say Venezuela is a democratic state at this moment. So we have three very different processes of drafting new constitutions. We have reforms of older constitutions that have been adapting via reform by the normal legislature without the need of a fully elected assembly or constitutional assembly. We have also transformative constitution, but with agreement and compromise between elites and civil society. and we also have non-democratic, non-liberal constitution making. As far as immunity, I would say that to regarding the first questions. The first question. As far as immunity to interference of political elite, I would say, in my take, and considering Chile's experience, that is not a goal in itself. I mean, the political elites have a value when drafting and when deliberating a new constitution. They have an experience that we have to take into account. They carry with them a certain tradition that it has to be recognized, while at the same time, obviously, including diverse interests and being the most inclusive as possible. So the problem, I think, is a process that is fully controlled by the elites. And this will be elites of the right wing or a left wing. It could be either way. And with that context, obviously, we weren't talking about a democratic process in the 21st century. The 21st century demands participation, inclusion. That's why these are so challenging times. And there's a very good article by Rafael Rubio. I would recommend you the article. Unfortunately, it's in Spanish, but if you could read or translate to Spanish, a very good article of how this balancing participation, representation, and deliberation in constitution making in the 21st century is so difficult. And it might be even impossible to really balance the three competing values. And in the end, the success of the process might depend more on luck, on pure chance or political circumstances variable, than on the design of the process itself, because it's so difficult to balance representation, participation, and deliberation in the complex societies of the 21st centuries. Look at the case of Iceland, that had a relatively similar experience of the first process in Chile. So an external constitutional body drafted by the civil society a proposal, but then it was just forgot by and not considered by the parliament, by the political elites. So relatively similar. Or control processes by the left wing in Latin America that had ended up with authoritarian regimes, non-democratic regimes, and non-democratic constitutions in Venezuela, for instance, or in Nicaragua, El Salvador. So we can talk about those examples as well. The need to balance these three principles is what we have to continue discussing, and I hope the Chilean experiences with the positive learnings in terms of democratic innovations, but also the complexities in terms of representation, and especially in terms of the deliberation and the representation, I think I hope can shed light, and I hope this conversation is enlightening, and we can continue the discussion how to improve our constitution making process to really balance out participation, representation, and deliberation.
Thank you very much, Esteban. I know there are other questions, but I think we have to end the conversation here. We are already past our allocated time. This was a very insightful presentation and very pertinent responses to the questions. So thank you very much, Esteban, for making the time to prepare and make the presentation and joining us in our conversation. So thank you very much again. And I would also like to thank all our guests. Thank you very much. So until we meet next time, goodbye. Bye-bye.
Thank you so much, Jonathan, and thank you for all the participants. Wonderful course, and let's continue this conversation. We have so much to learn about South Africa as well, and so much to share between each other.
Definitely, we'll continue the conversation.
Thank you so much.
If you can stay, then I can chat to you a bit. And others, goodbye.
Bye.
Very much.
Oh, thank you. Bye-bye.
So much. Very good questions. Thank you. You have a very, very nice course, dear Jonathan. Very good questions indeed.
Yes. I think this was also comes at a very good time because we were just discussing constitution making. So here, I don't know, your side of the world. Here, the academic year starts now. We are almost, I think, the second week of the academic year. So in this module, comparative constitutional law, this would be the second seminar on the constitution making. So I think it really fits very well with our discussion. So really, I think you have brought the practice, the real questions into the class. So I thank you very much for that. Very much appreciate it.
Thanks to you. I really enjoy the conversation. Thank you so much.
And I think the video will be available online if that's also okay with you. Usually we upload it on our YouTube account. I think my colleagues will do that. So I will also let you know once we do that.
Absolutely.
All right. So you said you'll be leaving soon, Leiden, or you're not sure yet?
Do you want to stop the recording because we're still?
Yeah, let me stop the recording. Yes. So that